Hi everyone. In the second episode of this series, we spoke to Oliver Kamm. Oliver is a leader writer and columnist at The Times, and we discuss his book, Mending the Mind, where he details his experiences with severe depression. As ever, if you enjoyed the episode, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. Hi Oliver, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Harry. Good to talk to you.
We always start by asking what your kind of relationship with mental health looks like.
Yes, I have had just one experience in my life of very severe clinical depression. I had no apparent susceptibility to it, no experience of it, and no family history of it. But a few years ago, it was the entire calendar year of 2014, I was stricken with what was diagnosed as severe clinical depression. It was unlike anything I'd experienced before or since. I made a full recovery, and since then, like anyone else, I've had my periodic ups and downs, my low moods, and my times of happiness and enjoyment. And broadly, I am a perfectly normal person in terms of mental health now. I say with a certain degree of embarrassment, in fact, that the public health crisis that we've experienced for the past year, which has taken such an intense toll, both on physical health and on people's mood, has left me broadly unafflicted in terms of mental health. I have the good fortune to be sufficiently advanced in my career, not to have worries for my livelihood, and to live in a nice home in a verdant part of London, and not to suffer the sort of difficulties that many others do in this crisis of being worried for their families and their livelihoods, and living perhaps in cramped and substandard and accommodation, and having relationship difficulties. All the things that are affecting people's mental health have passed me by in this public health crisis. So that's my background with mental health.
Yeah.
I had one very distinct period of severe depression, which led me to find out more about the condition.
Yeah, that's good to hear that you've had a good year despite the circumstances. So how did it kind of first manifest itself for you and develop? I read that you spoke about it as being a bit like a cloud, which is very similar to what one of our previous guests, Oliver Kamm, said, that he wakes up, that he can see this cloud and it eventually becomes kind of all-encompassing.
Exactly. Alistair has suffered depression periodically through his life. I've, fortunately for me, had only the one very severe experience of it. But however much it reoccurs in a person's life, there are recognizable features of it, and I recognize from the accounts of others, not only contemporaries like Alistair, but those who've suffered depression historically and have written about it, even in epochs when the term clinical depression wouldn't have been used. In reading up on the subject, I, for example, went back to the works of Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, who was known for his susceptibility to what was called melancholy at the time, we would call depression. And the symptoms are very much the same. It manifested itself, in my case, with all the diagnostic symptoms of depression according to the manuals, the medical manuals, things like a complete loss of appetite for recreation or pleasure or food, lassitude, a constant sense of guilt, chronic insomnia, and the cognitive distortions that are typical of a depressive. I believed I was evil, and the sort of imagery, the incident in which I knew I had a problem was I had a dramatic loss of memory, to the extent that I was out in central London, and I was unable to remember my own home address. And the imagery you cite Alistair referring to a cloud is exactly what I felt. It felt as if a cloud was enveloping the neighborhood, the street, the world, and divorcing me from it. And the imagery of the mental of those suffering from mental disorder is strikingly similar across cases.
Yeah, I think I can echo that. I kind of had the inability to sleep is quite classic. That's one that I had. The kind of feelings of worthlessness and lethargy and not taking interests in things that previously brought me pleasure. So I think those are fairly classics. But how did you personally? How are you able to tell the difference between? It's very obvious for someone like me who's been through it, but how are you able to tell the difference between just a general level of kind of normal low mood that everyone has in their lives versus something more clinical?
It's an absolutely central question about depression that you just posed. Everyone has low moods, periods of sadness and disappointment and grief. We all suffer thwarted ambitions, rejections, disappointments in love, bereavement, and the sort of things that would bring anyone low. And some of my friends have had far worse experiences than that. Friends of mine from Bosnia who have witnessed and survived the genocide of their communities and have managed to build successful and admirable lives despite these horrific circumstances. And it's crucial that depression is quite different from the sadnesses that we all feel. And it's also, in the case of those like me who've led successful lives professionally, have the good fortune to have devoted family and friends, depression is a quite abnormal reaction to periods of disappointment. I had difficult things happening to me in my life at a certain time that would predictably cause sadness, but the low mood did not disperse as time went on, as you would expect. It intensified, and those who were close to me noticed oddities about my behavior, and those in personal life noted oddities about my behavior, the fact that I seemed distant and lost weight dramatically in a short time. And those in professional life noticed it as well, with the additional quirk that my work suffered. My writing, I'm a professional writer, my writing became excruciatingly slow and was strewn with grammatical errors. So it was very clearly not a conventional period of sadness, but I still didn't recognize it for what it was, having no history of depression, until I went to the doctor and he diagnosed me as such. A very friendly, empathetic GP who showed me a checklist of symptoms, was needlessly apologetic that it was quite a simple visual aid. And I had the lot. I could have been a chapter, or at least a footnote, in a textbook of psychiatric disorders all on my own. It was a revelation.
Yeah, going back to what you just said there, an analogy that I kind of think of when I was in the midst of it, and then kind of when I've had it periodically since, was it's kind of like you're looking at life through a glass pane or something like that. You kind of, everything's going on around you, and you can see that, you know, it should be enjoyable, but actually you just can't quite grasp it, and you're not fully engaged in it.
Exactly. It is a different type of landscape from what you've known before. And it is disorienting for its bleakness and its strangeness, and disorienting and very disturbing and distressing.
Yeah, so moving on, you kind of write that actually that it is possible to make more than a recovery, which is a message that I think gets often lost in mental health diagnoses, that for some conditions you can actually get back to where you were before. And certainly for me, although I still have, bouts of it, that the understanding that you get from yourself having gone through something like this, you can actually recover to a better level than you were at before. So how did you go about recovering it, and what things worked for you, and what things were not so great?
Yes, certainly. There is a phrase that's been used in discussions of mental health, which is better than well. And it's been invoked particularly in debates over antidepressant medication, and the much misunderstood medication of SSRIs like fluoxetine, whose trade name is Prozac. Those who've advocated antidepressants, as I do, have sometimes, as I certainly do, have sometimes used the phrase better than well. And critics have taken this as an ominous hint of social engineering. That's not the case at all. But I don't use the phrase better than well myself precisely for that reason. I would say, however, that going through the experience of depression and receiving effective evidence-based treatments corrected certain cognitive distortions that I had labored under for a long, long time, even in a pre-depressive state. Those distortions were tending to think the worst of any setback, the catastrophizing instinct, which eventually, in a state of clinical depression, convinced me that I was not only fallible, as we all are, but evil. And the treatments I had were twofold. First, a course of antidepressants, which are not a cure-all by any means, and indeed are not a cure for depression at all, any more than treatments for the common cold are a cure for the cold. They are a way of managing symptoms better, coping better. They aid you in getting well rather than make you well or better than well. And the treatment that really was predominantly effective for me, and in some respects a revelation to me, was talking therapy of a type that has real clinical backing behind it. Principally cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, but also allied approaches such as compassion-focused therapy, which in testing my beliefs against the evidence with an empathetic personality, a skilled clinical psychologist on the other side, as it were, not only brought me out of depression eventually, though it was a long process, but created what the clinical psychologist referred to and aimed at, not as a normal me, but a new normal, someone whose emotions and understandings were somewhat sharper. And it was not an experience I would wish on anyone, clinical depression. It was the greatest pain of my life. But the process of recovery did make me a somewhat different person, not quite the same person as I'd been before.
Yeah, I think what you say about antidepressants is so key. I think for me, and I know a lot of other people think like this, that I was trying to do the things that I knew would make me better without antidepressants. And then I started them and saw them as something that allowed me to do the other things that would, address the root causes better. So after I started taking them, I could more fully engage in CBT. I was lucky enough to be able to see a psychologist, and I could start doing, things that I used to enjoy, like exercise again. But I don't think you weren't quite as lucky as I was to see a psychologist straight away. You had a different experience with psychoanalysis, which to my knowledge has less firm evidence than the methods that psychologists use.
Yes, indeed. Psychotherapy, is a very broad concept. It covers many things, many different disciplines, many different approaches, has different sets of patients. The first experience I had of psychological therapy or psychotherapy was with someone known as a psychodynamic therapist. And psychodynamic therapy has its origins in the approach of Sigmund Freud and his followers, who devised methods of psychoanalysis. It's moved on a long way since then. It's much more time limited, but it has, in its intellectual roots, the belief that mood disorders like clinical depression are the outcome of unresolved conflicts in one's psyche, one's unconscious, deriving from experiences earlier in life. And I did have prolonged sessions with a psychodynamic therapist, which were not effective because, for one thing, she seemed to be trawling through my memories for a key to understand my present discontents, when I knew that those memories were just not relevant to my condition now. They were of an earlier stage in life when I was not the same person, and I happened to have had a very happy childhood with devoted parents and a good deal of satisfaction in my life. My view of this type of therapy is I'm a little wary when people say, well, such and such an approach worked for me. I do think that there is a role for psychodynamic therapy in some psychiatric disorders. Trained psychiatrists who see very ill people in the NHS typically often come across people who have no social contact to speak of at all, who may never have had a positive relationship in their lives, who would have been neglected or even abused as children and have been unable to form relationships as adults. Now, going through the traumas that such people have suffered using the techniques of psychodynamic therapy may be very helpful, but the evidence that it's useful for clinical depression is just not there. The randomized controlled trials have been done, and they don't suggest that this form of therapy is effective for depression. They do, however, suggest that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is superior to other forms of talking therapy and the placebos in treating depression. And as I say, I'm a little wary when people say, well, whatever works for me. It's a great thing if someone gets benefit, believes they get benefit from and alleviation from depression, from whatever works for them, indeed. But the data matters, the tests matter, and my message is that it's not arbitrary treatments for depression and other mood disorders. There is good science behind certain methods, and we can build on those to get a better understanding of depression and its treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you wrote about was, I suppose, kind of related to the fact that some treatments work and some treatments have less efficacy behind them, is about the skepticism of people that you may know or that you may have worked with, seemingly highly intelligent, well-educated people that just didn't believe in that something like depression is a medical condition, and that actually it's more of a kind of fashionable 21st century millennial millennial
Yes.
disease. So I was wondering what kind of damage do you think that opinions like that are doing, and why do you think people react to depression in this kind of way?
Yes. There is a very widespread view. It's particularly prominent in, maybe I just see it for this reason, it's particularly prominent in my profession of journalism, that depression is a voguish medicalization of the sadnesses that we all suffer from time to time in our lives. And there remains a sort of stigma attaching to mental disorder that you don't find with diseases of other organs, or physical injuries. And I think, to be as generous as I can, the reason for this skepticism is that the illness, that illnesses of the mind are not directly observable in the way that illnesses of other organs are. We know from the naked eye that someone has suffered a breakage of a limb. We know from x-rays that someone has a disease of the lungs or the heart, but we can't directly observe illnesses of the mind. We can't directly observe the whatever happens in the brain, a misfiring of neurons perhaps within the brain that cause clinical depression. We only know clinical depression, or can only diagnose clinical depression, from its symptoms rather than from its direct causes. And this, I think, lends to a public skepticism and even a stigma about the reality of mental illness. I want to stress that clinical depression is an illness like any other, that is physiological in origin, because we know the mind depends on the brain. It's an illness like any other, with a complex mix of causes, some biological, some social. And I, having suffered a severe mental illness, I wanted to come out as a sufferer and explain, first of all, find out as much as I could about the state of science, neuroscience, psychiatry, neuropharmacology, clinical psychology, and what they said about depression, and to convey the message that, yes, clinical depression is a real and very severe, can be a very severe illness that has a tremendous cost in welfare and in human life, and that there are sound, science-based, evidence-based treatments that can help.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of moving on to something a bit different, and you wrote in the prelogue to your book about COVID and how that has potentially impacted the mental health of a lot of people. How do you think that when we come out of when we eventually come out of it, that it will be viewed on as having an impact on people's mental health, and what do you think the landscape will look like going forward?
I fear that that there will be a very substantial problem of a rise in the incidence of clinical depression and other psychiatric disorders. That is what historically was observed after the great influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, which is the most direct historical analogy we can have for the current pandemic. One factor in this toll on mental health is inevitably and necessarily the remedial actions that have been taken to stop the spread of infection, the lockdowns, the isolation. Clinical psychologists have judged that at any one time, billions of people across the globe have been in some form of lockdown. And this is bound to have had a very significant effect on people's mental health when we can't see those we care about, can't even get on a bicycle or a train to get a change of scenery. This is bound to have affected people's mental health, because the most important means of contending with mental disorder, that of social connection is not available to us. This is not, I hasten to add, an argument against these measures of lockdown. On the contrary, we know that COVID is a multi-system illness that has an effect itself on mental health. There is some evidence of direct neurological impacts, reports of seizures, of cognitive disturbance, of confusion. And there's been a study by Oxford University researchers suggesting that those who survive COVID are at significantly greater risk of developing mental health problems in the immediate aftermath. So I do fear that there will be a substantial rise in the number of cases of people suffering from clinical depression and other mood disorders. And in pre-pandemic times, it was very substantial already. The World Health Organization estimated in the year before the pandemic that there were 264 million people globally suffering from depression. And depression is the predominant cause of suicide in the world today. So it is a huge problem, and it has immense costs in welfare and happiness and human life. And it's going to be a substantial issue in public health policy as, hopefully, the current crisis recedes. The mental health issue will definitely remain.
Do you think, obviously, it's very different for the individual suffering, but do you think, perhaps slightly paradoxically, that what we've been through for the last year and the lockdowns and things will actually make us perhaps think more about mental health generally, and perhaps it will receive, greater funding for the evidence-based treatments that we've spoken about before?
I think there is some ground for hope on that point. There is enshrined in legislation the principle of parity of esteem between mental health and physical health, and indeed the whole division between mental health and physical health rests on a somewhat unhelpful dualistic notion that the mind is separate from the body, whereas actually it's the outcome of physical processes, physiological processes. I do think that the issue of mental health, which has been so prominent in the current crisis, will remain an issue of great public concern. And I hope that there will be a much greater availability of evidence-based psychological treatments in the NHS, because the coverage at the moment is patchy, and it's a very, very vital issue of public health provision. So that, I hope, will be the message coming out of this crisis, and it's one that I certainly intend to stress myself.
Yeah, and the thing we always kind of finish up by asking is how you look after your mental health at the moment. I suppose especially relevant in the last year.
I periodically, I've had no reoccurrence of depression, but naturally, like everyone else, I've had periods of worry and sadness, not least during this crisis. Family, friends have died from COVID, and I've been unable to bid them farewell. I've been worried, not for me, as I have a very happy and secure life, but I've been worried for those I care about and apprehensive about the future. Will there be a time when we can hug each other again? When I felt the onset of depressive thoughts, I have reverted to the sort of commonsensical but science-based techniques that were taught to me by the clinical psychologist when I was in a depressive state, which is to test the catastrophizing instinct against the available evidence and not to get locked into a cycle of constant rumination. If there's an issue that's worrying me, I don't dwell on it, and I particularly don't dwell on it in the recesses of the night when I'm still liable to sleep badly. It is just to put it on one side, deliberately mentally put it on one side and say to myself, well, maybe I do need to know the answer to this, but not now. And the answer isn't available. And there's nothing constructive to be gained by speculating or ruminating upon it. Let me attend to something that is more capable of resolution and a more constructive line of thought. So that's how I look after my mental health. The techniques that I learned from good psychological therapy when I was seriously ill.
Brilliant, yeah, evidence-based stuff. And where can we find out more about your writing and the book in general?
My book, Mending the Mind, The Art and Science of Overcoming Clinical Depression, is published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. There are, of course, no shops open at the moment as we speak, but it is available from fine retailers online everywhere, and it contains the fruits of my researches in mental health. I've written widely on the subject, particularly for the Times, and I will be doing so in future, and I hope to make the subjects we've been discussing much more widely known.
Brilliant. Oliver, that's been really interesting, and have a nice rest of the day.
My pleasure, Harry. Thanks very much for talking with me. All the best.
Hi, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a quick note to say, that although the things I discussed with the guests we may find helpful, I'm not a trained medical professional. If you're struggling with your mental health, please contact your GP or speak to an organisation like Samaritans on 116 123.